They thought they could bury a man's legacy with a signature. In one night, the HOA stole 1,500 acres of blood-earned land, laughing as they carved his family's name off the records. But what they didn't know was that the same pin they used to destroy him would become the weapon that stripped them of their $10 million lakefront mansions. Justice was about to be written in fire and fury. And before we begin, like this video and comment where you're watching from so we know who's standing with us against corruption. They announced it as policy, not theft, and stamped a seal over 1,500 acres like a boot on a throat, while Karen smiled for a photo, as if legacy were a trophy and not the marrow of a family name. And across town a phone buzzed with a message that said sold, as if a life could be emptied that easily. So where does a heart go when the paper says it no longer belongs here? Board members paraded confidence, posting notices, fencing off memories, grinning about assessments that would never reach the people who bled for this soil. And their laughter moved like nails across a chalkboard of history until even silence felt accused. Because what kind of neighbor celebrates another neighbor's erasure? He arrived to a spread of signs shaped like verdicts, breathed through the hurt like a fighter counting backward, and read the stamped letters that claimed new ownership while his father's lessons pressed against his ribs like armor. Because a promise whispered over a grave does not bend for committees, does it? At the clubhouse, he faced Karen, and her voice carried the weightless cruelty of someone who mistakes paperwork for power. And she said it's done while he said not yet. And everyone nearby pretended to check their phones, but watched the way a storm watches a match. Because who believes a signature can outmuscle a vow? He walked to the records counter and asked for everything. The transfers, the minutes, the votes that never happened, and the clerk slid folders with the casual shrug of a bystander. But the pages told a crooked story, and the notary stamp looked tired, as if even ink can't pretend forever. So who taught them to counterfeit certainty? The board toasted themselves in social posts, victory captions underneath borrowed chandeliers, while contractors measured lines that weren't theirs, and he saved every frame like a prosecutor building a spine out of evidence, because arrogance leaves fingerprints even when it wears gloves. So where will they hide when the lights turn honest? A line in the bylaws snagged his attention like a fishhook, a clause about authority and forfeiture, about what happens when dues, deeds, and jurisdiction misalign. And the wording felt like a loose thread in a velvet curtain, the kind you pull once and the whole show falls. So what happens when the stage belongs to the wrong actors? He pressed the pages flat and felt a steadiness he hadn't felt since the last handshake with his father, and a thought cut through the noise with surgical calm. HOAs are built from paper, so paper can unbuild them. And if this fight hits your chest the way it hits his, like this video, and tell where you're watching from so your city knows you stand tall. Because who else is tired of signatures that think they're swords? Neighbors whispered sympathy in driveways but feared fines more than shame. And he didn't blame them, because fear is a tax and power knows how to collect. Yet he kept moving, collecting affidavits and timelines, and that one neglected audit note that looks harmless until it shouts. So how loud can truth get when it finally finds a microphone? Night fell with intention, and a message reached him from a number that had been quiet for years, belonging to someone who once filed papers no one else read, a person who muttered there's something you should see and signed off before courage could second-guess itself. So what happens when the door you were never meant to open unlocks in your hand? The fences went up like scars, hammered into ground that had carried his family name for generations, and the HOA called it progress, while neighbors stared at the posts with the uneasy silence of people who knew theft but feared fines more than justice. Karen walked the property lines with a clipboard as if possession came with paper instead of truth, smiling with that smirk that only the protected wear, while the man they thought they buried watched from a distance with eyes sharpened by betrayal. How long can arrogance parade before it trips over its own shoelaces? They rented parcels of his land like carnival prizes, shaking hands with strangers who believed the HOA's signature was law. Every dollar they pocketed dripped like gasoline on a fire, because he collected every receipt, every boast, every photo they posted online of picnics on property that wasn't theirs. They thought they were untouchable, but every empire starts crumbling from the inside, doesn't it? One night he found it, buried in the bylaws like a venomous seed no one watered, an obscure clause about jurisdiction and forfeiture, written decades ago by someone too careful for his own time. It said if the HOA seized property outside its original charter, Every asset under its name could be challenged. That clause wasn't a loophole, it was dynamite. How many tyrants collapsed not from bullets, but from their own signatures? The next day, as Karen laughed over coffee with board members, he was sitting across from a man who once kept the county's files in perfect rows. The retired clerk's hands shook from age but steadied when they traced the ink across deeds and minutes. The old man muttered they rushed it. They skipped protocol, and if anyone bothered to look, it would all unravel. That mutter carried more weight than the HOA's entire fence line. Isn't it strange how the quiet ones often hold the sharpest knives? Karen flaunted her power at community gatherings, mocking the one man she thought finished, calling him reckless for thinking heritage could outlast paperwork. But behind her laughter, cracks widened. Other board members whispered about audits, about that one clause, about what might happen if he really pushed. Fear is contagious, and even the powerful catch it when truth knocks too loud. How long before loyalty bends toward survival? He built his case with the patience of a surgeon and the fury of a son who remembers promises. Affidavits piled. Witnesses who once kept their heads down began to step forward, their voices carrying years of silence. Every document was a bullet, every clause a weapon. Yet Karen doubled down, louder, more vicious, as if screaming could drown out inevitability. Do tyrants ever hear themselves when the walls begin to echo back? Then came the whisper from the clerk's lips, the one sentence that cracked the entire masquerade. Those lakefront mansions, the pride of the HOA, weren't properly recorded. Their foundation stood on contested land, tangled in the same fraud that stole his acres. The HOA didn't own the jewels they flaunted. They were standing on quicksand and never knew it. Imagine the irony, stealing land only to lose your own palaces. Would you call that justice or poetry? He smiled for the first time in months, not with arrogance, but with the weight of certainty. The board had mocked, fenced, rented, celebrated, and jeered, but all their victories were built on foundations they never owned. He now held the knife by the handle, and they didn't even know they were bleeding. If this revelation hit you the way it hit him, leave a comment. What would you have done in his place? Fight back in silence, or strike them where it hurts most? The pieces of his plan began to align like teeth in a trap, the retired clerk nodding in grim approval, neighbors beginning to whisper that maybe the HOA had overstepped. Karen sensed movement, her smile tightening, her voice shriller at board meetings. But she didn't know the next blow wasn't a threat, it was a guarantee. What happens when the very mansions they flaunt as trophies are no longer theirs to stand in? The night of their so-called victory party was dressed in arrogance. Karen raised a glass high, toasting the board for securing what they bragged was their biggest triumph, bragging about land they never bled for, property they never earned, and mansions they believed would stand untouchable. Laughter filled the room like smoke, choking every hint of humility, but outside those walls a storm of paper and proof waited like loaded ammunition. How long can a celebration last when the ground beneath it is already burning? He didn't storm in with fury. He walked with calm precision, carrying a folder that weighed more than their champagne-soaked confidence. The room quieted, not out of respect, but from the uneasy recognition that the man they mocked still stood unbroken. He laid documents across their polished table, deeds and filings that cut sharper than steel. Their smiles froze. Karen smirked through clenched teeth, dismissing the evidence as fantasy, but her eyes flickered when she saw the county seal stamped in fresh ink. How fast can pride curdle into panic? Her voice, sharp and mocking, carried through the hall as she laughed it off, telling the crowd he was desperate, clinging to dust. But the air shifted when deputies stepped inside, invited not by rumor, but by subpoena. They carried the authority that Karen couldn't bend, and as they examined the pages, silence wrapped the room. The board fidgeted, their eyes darting from paper to badge, realizing every word they'd spoken in arrogance was being weighed by law. How many empires fall in the space of a heartbeat? The deputy looked up and confirmed the unthinkable. The mansions, the pride of the HOA, weren't secured. They were contested property, tethered to fraud, their titles as hollow as their promises. Karen's glass slipped from her hand, shattering across the floor as whispers turned into gasps. Board members who once jeered at him now stepped back from her, as if guilt were contagious. Isn't it strange how loyalty evaporates the moment consequences walk through the door? He stood without raising his voice, because he didn't need to. The evidence shouted for him. Each page was a verdict, each clause a weapon. The neighbors who had gathered for free food and drinks now stared at the spectacle of power unraveling, their loyalty shifting, their curiosity hooked. Would you have trusted the system at that moment, or burned the entire structure to the ground? Tell me in the comments, because the choice between patience and fire is one every betrayed soul wrestles with. Karen tried to shout the deputies down, insisting her signatures were law, her board untouchable, but her words cracked under the weight of undeniable proof. Her allies stumbled, fumbling excuses, pointing fingers at each other, desperation dripping from every sentence. The party that began with pride now dissolved into chaos, champagne spilling like tears on the floor. Isn't it wild how quickly wolves turn on their own when the hunt goes wrong? He gathered his papers and turned, not to leave, but to face the crowd, his voice steady as he promised this was just the beginning. The board thought they had stripped him of everything, but in truth, they had exposed themselves. Their mansions weren't castles, they were cards stacked on sand. And now that the tide had turned, he would make sure every single one collapsed. Do you feel that rush, the moment justice finally cracks the shell of arrogance? Drop a heart if you're still here, because this story is only sharpening. Karen's face twisted with rage, her pride refusing to die quietly, but her power slipped through her hands like water. The deputies left with copies of the documents, their presence a silent warning that law was no longer on her side. The board dispersed into whispers, their laughter gone, replaced by the dread of what tomorrow would bring. And tomorrow would not be merciful, because tonight was only the ambush. The war had only just begun, and the next battle would not be fought in shadows or parties. It would be fought in courtrooms where arrogance meets its final executioner. The courthouse buzzed like a hornet's nest the morning the case was called. The board walked in with polished shoes and smug expressions, Karen leading the march with a stare that could cut glass. She whispered to her lawyers with the confidence of someone who thought money could outshout truth. But behind her polish was a tremor, the kind of fear that hides in clenched jaws and two quick smiles. How long can bravado hold before it shatters under cross-examination? The opening arguments hit like hammers. Her attorneys painted him as reckless, a bitter man chasing shadows. They spoke with rehearsed authority, flashing binders like weapons, but their confidence faltered when his counsel laid down the clause that stripped their power clean. The room shifted. The air itself seemed to thicken. Words on a page became daggers in the hands of justice. Isn't it strange how silence grows loud when arrogance is cornered? Karen rose to the stand, her voice sharp, her answers clipped with disdain. She claimed the land was theirs by order, by vote, by right. But then came the questions that cut deeper than she expected. Who voted? Where were the minutes? Why was the county never informed? Her confidence cracked under the weight of receipts she didn't have. The jury leaned forward, sensing blood. Even the judge's eyebrow raised at the gall of such blatant invention. Can lies survive when truth is carved into the record? He sat watching, not with rage but with the patience of a predator who knows the trap is closing. Every denial Karen offered only tightened the net. Every contradiction another nail in the coffin she built with her own arrogance. The courtroom, once her stage, became her execution chamber. The people who once feared her fines now smirked in the gallery, savoring the sight of a tyrant gasping for control. Wouldn't you savor that moment, too? Then the clerk, his quiet ally, took the stand. His hands shook, but his voice carried decades of credibility. He recounted the missing filings, the skipped steps, the notary errors, each revelation striking like a drumbeat of guilt. Karen's lawyers scrambled, objecting, stammering, sweating through suits that no longer felt protective. The board members shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves, abandoning her piece by piece. Isn't betrayal sweetest when it happens in full daylight? The judge leaned forward, his gavel striking down objections with cold finality. The documents proved undeniable. The land seizure was fraud. The HOA's authority was null. And more than that, the mansions they boasted about sat on contested ground, now subject to the very laws they thought shielded them. The decision was delivered like thunder. The court sided with him. He hadn't just won his land, he had taken their empire. And if you're still watching right now, drop a heart, because this is the twist Karen never saw coming. Karen erupted, shouting over the ruling, slamming her hands against the table, accusing the court of conspiracy. But her tantrum only made the verdict sweeter. The judge silenced her with a warning, and deputies stepped closer, their presence heavy. The crowd buzzed with excitement, some clapping, others recording the spectacle of power crumbling live before their eyes. Isn't karma loud when it finally speaks? He didn't smile, not yet. Victory wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something greater. With the judge's decision, he had the right not only to reclaim his acres, but to seize their prized mansions. The very walls they toasted inside now belonged to him. Their $10 million fortresses of arrogance were his to dismantle, sell, or burn in the court of public opinion. But he wouldn't stop at possession. He planned something sharper, something final. Karen sat, broken but still burning with fury, whispering threats under her breath. The board looked away, ashamed, beaten, already scattering like rats from a sinking ship. He gathered his papers, calm, steady, already preparing the next strike. Because this wasn't closure. This was only stage 2 of justice. And stage 2 would sting worse than anything Karen could imagine. The court adjourned, but the war moved outside those walls. He wasn't done. Not until their mansions, their trophies, their very symbols of power were gone forever. And tomorrow, the auction block would become the stage where the HOA's pride was sold to the highest bidder. The auction drew a crowd bigger than any HOA meeting ever had. Word spread like wildfire. Mansions once guarded by gates and arrogance were now on the block, sold off piece by piece. Neighbors who once whispered in fear came with wide eyes, holding coffee in one hand and curiosity in the other. Investors circled like sharks, smelling blood in the water. Every bidder was ready to carve a slice out of the empire that thought it was untouchable. How poetic is it when pride becomes merchandise? He stood at the front, steady, unflinching, watching the board members squirm in seats that suddenly felt too small. Karen sat in the corner, pale, her jaw tight, her nails digging into her palm as the auctioneer began the first call. Her mansion, the jewel of the lakefront, wasn't scheduled last. No, it was placed right in the middle, like a dagger waiting for her heart. Isn't justice sweetest when it strikes at the peak of denial? The gavel slammed down again and again, every strike another nail in the coffin of their reign. The first mansion sold within minutes, the crowd gasping at how fast wealth changed hands. Board members muttered to each other, sweating, begging Karen to do something, but her words stuck in her throat. Every bid was a reminder that the HOA no longer owned authority. They were the ones being owned. Would you have shown mercy, or would you have let them bleed out in front of everyone? Karen couldn't hold it anymore. She shot up, her voice shrill, screaming that the sale was illegal, begging the crowd not to participate, cursing the auctioneer. Security moved to calm her, but her outbursts only fueled the excitement. People leaned in, phones out, recording the downfall of the woman who once fined them for grass growing too high. The same neighbors she tormented now chuckled at her tantrum. Isn't karma delicious when the audience is the same people you once humiliated? Then came her turn. The auctioneer announced her mansion, the crown jewel. Karen's voice cracked as she pleaded with him to skip it, her words collapsing into sobs and rage. She turned toward him, the man she thought she had destroyed, begging, bargaining, promising money, power, anything to make him stop. But he didn't need to answer, because the gavel did it for him. Bidding began, fierce and fast, numbers climbing higher and higher as Karen's world collapsed in front of her. Can you imagine watching strangers put price tags on the walls you once called untouchable? When the gavel struck final, Karen fell silent. Her mansion, the pride of her arrogance, was no longer hers. A young couple stepped forward with their winning bid, smiling as they signed the paperwork. They thanked him for the opportunity, their voices trembling with joy, while Karen crumbled, her body shaking with the reality that everything she built on fraud had been erased in seconds. Isn't it powerful when joy for one becomes justice for another? He looked at the crowd and finally spoke, his words sharp but calm. This wasn't revenge, he said, it was restoration. Every penny from these mansions would go back to rebuilding the land the HOA tried to steal, funding families they crushed, and restoring a community they broke. It wasn't just about winning. It was about rewriting a legacy. If you're still here, like this video and tell me, would you have sold it or shown mercy? The auction rolled on, each home falling like dominoes, each sale another chapter closing on corruption. The board members looked like ghosts, their power gone, their faces pale. Karen sat frozen, her eyes hollow, as her former empire dissolved in front of her. By the end, nothing remained of their pride but signatures on papers that stripped them of everything. The same ink they used to steal had now erased them. Isn't it strange how poetic justice always finds the perfect pen? He left the auction not with a smirk, but with a plan. The money wasn't for him. It was for something bigger. The land would live again, families would breathe easier, and the name carved into that soil would remain untouchable. But as he walked away, he felt the burn of Karen's eyes drilling into him, her rage smoldering like embers that refused to die. And deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Because some enemies don't fade, they plot. The profits from the auction came in like a tide, millions flowing from the sale of those mansions that once loomed over the community as monuments to arrogance. But instead of hoarding the wealth, he turned it outward, into the soil and the people. Fences were torn down, families received the help they had begged for, and the land his father once walked began to breathe again. Each brick laid, each acre restored was a promise fulfilled. Isn't it powerful when money once stolen becomes the very tool that heals? Neighbors who once avoided him now stood at his side, offering hands, tools, and loyalty. They spoke with gratitude heavy in their voices, some admitting they feared Karen too much to act before, others confessing they had thought no one could ever win against her. Now they stood watching the rebirth of something bigger than land. It was dignity stitched back together. And if you're still here, show it with a heart in the comments, because justice doesn't survive unless people stand behind it. Karen, meanwhile, sank deeper into the shadows of her own downfall. The mansion she once paraded through was gone, her authority stripped, and now she was left in a cramped apartment she could barely afford. The woman who fined neighbors for cracked driveways now argued with landlords about late rent. Her phone calls went unanswered, her allies abandoned her, and every glance from the community carried both satisfaction and pity. Isn't it haunting when the throne you built becomes a cage? She tried to reassert control in small ways, whispering threats at the grocery store, hissing promises of revenge when no one else could hear, but her words carried no weight anymore. The board she once commanded now avoided her like a curse. Some fled town altogether, ashamed to face the neighbors they exploited. Karen was left alone with nothing but rage and the bitter taste of irrelevance. How much louder does silence get when it's all you have left? He didn't celebrate Karen's fall with cruelty. He poured himself into the legacy. He built scholarships with the money, restored old barns, repaired roads, and opened parts of the land to families who had been pushed away. Children ran where fences once stood, and elders wept at the sight of fields alive again. He remembered his father's voice, telling him that land is more than dirt, it's memory, it's blood, it's promise. And with every step, he honored that vow. Wouldn't you have done the same if your family's name was written in that soil? The irony was sharp. The very community Karen ruled through fear now thrived without her. Instead of dues, there was cooperation. Instead of fines, there was freedom. Neighbors who once kept curtains drawn now left doors open. The HOA that claimed to be order had only ever been a parasite, and without it, the town was more alive than ever. Isn't it strange how sometimes destruction is the only path to renewal? But Karen wasn't finished. No tyrant ever fades quietly. Beneath her humiliation burned a rage that refused to die. She whispered to anyone who would listen that this wasn't over. She called lawyers, filed petty complaints, and showed up at community meetings even when no one wanted her there. She was an ember pretending to be a flame. And the danger of an ember is how easily it can spark when no one's watching. What would you do with someone who refuses to let go? One night, as he returned from a meeting about using the funds for a new school, he noticed a car idling near his property, headlights off, engine low. The silhouette inside was unmistakable, the posture of someone who once thought she owned everything in sight. Karen wasn't done. She was waiting, watching, planning. The land was his again. The community was stronger than ever, but in the shadows, a storm was gathering with her name on it. Because humiliation may break the body, but vengeance fuels the desperate. And Karen was desperate enough to burn everything she couldn't have. Karen's rage finally boiled over in the dead of night. She crept back onto the land she once claimed as hers, clutching cans of fuel and matches, determined to scorch the earth she could no longer own. She whispered to herself that if she couldn't have it, no one would. Flames licked the edges of barns, sparks caught in the wind, and the air filled with the crackle of destruction. It wasn't just vandalism. It was desperation sharpened into madness. How far will a fallen tyrant go when pride is all that's left? But she wasn't invisible. A neighbor saw the glow and called before the fire could spread. Sirens wailed in the distance as he arrived, sprinting toward the blaze with fury pounding in his chest. He caught her there, match still in her hand, her eyes wild, her hair tangled, her voice breaking as she screamed that he had ruined her life. He shouted back that she had ruined her own, every word cutting deeper than any flame. Isn't it strange how guilt always tries to dress itself as revenge? Karen swung at him, striking with the desperation of someone who had already lost. He grabbed her wrist, yanking the match free, holding her in place as the fire department stormed in, dousing the flames before they devoured the barn. Deputies arrived seconds later, their flashlights catching the horror on her face. Her body went limp as they cuffed her hands, dragging her toward the patrol car while she screamed at the night sky that it wasn't fair. But fairness had never been her currency, had it? The neighbors gathered, watching the fall in real time. Some shook their heads. Others whispered that they always knew it would come to this. Phones lit up, capturing her humiliation. The woman who once fined them for cracked sidewalks now shoved into the back of a squad car. The same community she tormented now stood as witnesses to her ruin. Can you feel that satisfaction? The weight of justice finally snapping chains in public view? He didn't smile. His victory wasn't about her tears. It was about the land standing unburned, about the children who would wake tomorrow to fields intact, about the legacy his father entrusted to him still alive. Karen's screams echoed into the distance as the car pulled away, fading into the night like the final notes of a song no one wanted to hear again. Isn't it poetic when the villain writes her own ending? Days later, he walked the land once more, past rebuilt barns and fields that would outlive both him and her. The money from the auctions now flowed into schools, into families, into futures. What the HOA stole in arrogance had been transformed into hope. Karen's name became a warning, her story told not with sympathy, but as a lesson of greed and pride. And his name, the one they tried to erase, was written stronger than ever in the soil. Wouldn't you call that victory? He paused at the edge of the property, remembering his father's words. Protect the land, protect the name. He had done both, not with violence, but with patience, not with destruction, but with truth sharpened into a blade. The community cheered him, the courts honored him, and the very earth beneath his feet seemed to breathe easier. This wasn't just about acres. It was about legacy, justice, and the kind of strength that cannot be bought or stolen. If you felt that moment, like this video and share it so more people see what happens when greed meets justice. Karen sat in a cell miles away, her empire reduced to ashes, her name cursed where it once commanded fear. And yet, even there, she still muttered promises of vengeance, clinging to pride like a drowning woman clings to air. But her threats meant nothing now. The story was no longer hers. It belonged to the man who refused to break, to the neighbors who refused to forget, to the legacy that refused to die. Isn't it incredible how justice, once unleashed, cannot be chained again? The land stood. The family's name stood. The community stood. And Karen fell. Forever.